Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to any first-timers and everyone else. Thanks for lending your ear once more. I do hope everyone is meeting this moment feeling reasonably well. That the discordant notes have not been enough to sabotage the orchestra of your day thus far. Which actually goes to something I've been playing with quite a lot, where I enjoy thinking about the way my day is unfolding, or even my life is unfolding, as a piece of music would. That there's a rhythm and a tempo to it, that there's harmony and there's discord, and that I'm playing my part, but I gotta listen, because if I just play my part without listening to everything that's going on, then I'm just like playing by myself and I'm not playing with the orchestra of life. But if I can find a way to play my part in a way that is fitting in, that is in time with the meter of my life and the world that I observe when I walk out the door. Not necessarily on the screens, but when I walk outside and I feel into the air and the trees and the soil and the sound of the birds, that there's a very grand orchestra at play. And it feels good. It feels like my life takes on a jam quality. I'm jamming out, you know? And it's okay if you miss a beat, or if you're off here for a little while, you just get back on as soon as you can. The song keeps on going. And this viewpoint is in no small part to my guest today, Joshua Schrei. Josh was here 2 years ago, and if you've been a regular listener since then, you've definitely heard his influence on this show. Back then, when he was on the show, I had recently discovered his podcast, the Emerald Podcast, and was really blown away. I joined his Patreon group after he came on the show, like right after he came on the show. I felt like I wanted to continue the conversation I started with him. So I signed up for his thing, and as part of that, you get access to these 2 Zoom meetings with him each month. And I've drawn inspiration from them again and again. The lines of questioning that you hear me going into are often spurred by conversations I've got to listen to or had with Josh and his group. So recently, if you've been listening, there's been some pretty intense talk I've been into about, higher powers and spirit, and I'm always calling up this idea of animism with people. Well, I felt like it was time to touch base with Josh and bring him back on the show and ask him some of my most burning and pressing questions. And frankly, they're the kinds of questions you can't just ask anyone. But Josh so rose to the challenge, and he gave me some real gems to chew on, as he often is able to do, that have just been really fruitful, including this idea of the musical nature of interrelationality, as well as having a nice way to understand some of these questions I've been having around non-duality and duality and supreme beings. Josh has a really helpful way of framing things, at least for me. And most importantly, it puts me in a place where I feel less a need to question and more sense of direction, which is just invaluable. There's so few sources for that, and I'm very grateful that Josh was willing to come back on and engage with me. Truly a pleasure. and an honor for me to share it with you all today. Real quick before we get to it, I do have just a couple of announcements. First, I've got a couple of in-person gigs coming up. Saturday, July 29th, I'm going to be in Garden City, New York. September 23rd and 24th, I'm going to do a weekend in Manchester, England. Let me also mention that my year-long online teacher training is currently half the regular price. You can start anytime at half the regular price. And if none of those things are for you, there's a whole range of other options on my website. For as little as $5 a month, you can have a podcast premium subscription, get full access to the archives of the show, all the way through several other subscriptions for live classes or on-demand stuff. We try to have a good spectrum of things for anybody's situation. So if you want to find ways to connect with me outside of just listening to this, you can find everything at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all, I don't want to keep us from it anymore. I will touch base with you on the other side, but we're going to go ahead and get into this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Joshua Schrei. Hello?
Hello, you there?
I am. Hey, Josh.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good, all in all. Yourself?
A little hectic. My whole family is taking off for Europe tomorrow, so.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm glad I caught you.
Yeah.
And I'm already recording. If it's okay, I'd like to consider us having just begun. Is that all right?
Yeah, totally.
All right. Well, I'm so glad that you fit me in before you were off and about. I really appreciate you giving me this time. Thank you for it.
Yeah, no problem at all. It's great to be back.
Well, I have to say, Josh, just for anybody listening and just to take this moment publicly to say, I'm so grateful for the work that you've been doing. I mean, you were on the show it's coming on 2 years ago. And, for anybody listening to this who hasn't been listening to the Emerald podcast, and I would also add subscribing to your Patreon and being part of your discussion group, all I can say is you're slipping, because it has really been very enriching for me and inspiring. And a lot of the conversations I've been having here on the show and certain lines of questioning that I always bring in that a lot of people express to me that they appreciate, they really have come out of inquiries that I've gotten from talks that you've been facilitating. So just due props and thank you so much for it.
Yeah, well, thanks for the great feedback, and I'm glad the work is having an impact. And yeah, it's a joy to have these discussions.
Yeah, and it seems like you really stepped up your production game too, just to give you a compliment on that. And I don't know if that's because maybe your listenership grew, or maybe one happened before the other or not, but I'm curious, is it my imagination, or are there more people interested in the idea of animism now than a few years ago?
I think that there are a growing number of people who are, you could say, feeling the call to the return to wonder and imagination and understanding that, kind of the promises that we've been given about the purpose of existence have, for the most part, been proven to be pretty false over the past, century, but increasingly in this century, the promise that the free market is going to bring happiness, the promise that, science is the answer to everything, when science can point the way, but science isn't an answer into itself, right? So I think you have an increasing number of people who are feeling a want to return to an animate vision of the cosmos, for sure. And then, as far as the production of the podcast, I mean, that's just really me nerding out on all the music production skills that I once learned, once upon a time, and
well, it's paying off, man. It's paying off. I mean, you're producing something that's really great. That's what I mean.
Thank you. Yeah. And finding a way to integrate incredible musicians and performers into the episodes. So cool partnerships with bands like Rising Appalachia and singers like Pia Lutzi, and just people with incredible voices who are responding to the feel of the podcast and the journey, the musical journey that it is.
Well, I certainly am. And I had Sophie Strand on after you came on, because I've been so, to your point, when I discovered you 2 years ago, I was just like really in need of some healing. And the only thing that was working really was like going into the forest and singing. And then you were talking about that. And then you came on the show and you talked about how, 99% of my ancestors related to the planet and the world in a way that we would now maybe call like animistic. And I took that to heart, and also noted that, well, that would also mean that yoga really developed through most of its history in the minds and the perceptions of people who lived in relationship to the world in that way too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Indian tradition is unabashedly animist. And, there have been times in the history of Indian tradition where, like, colonial scholars have tried to kind of distance it from animism. There have been false divisions made between like the high quote unquote teachings of India and the like more rural, lower animistic forms of Indian teaching. But fundamentally, when you go to India, you realize that that's kind of a colonial construction, that Hinduism, what's called Hinduism, and Indian tradition are profoundly animist, and the Buddhist texts, the Hindu texts, the yogic texts, are speaking about nagas and yakshas and gandharvas, and the list of animate beings goes on and on and on and on and on. And the whole context in which yoga happens, tantra happens, all these things happen is a animate context. It's the context of a living cosmos and how to navigate it.
Well, I think that a lot of folks, myself included, can get around as an idea that makes perfect sense, but what it actually means can be a whole other thing. And so what I would say is, first, for myself personally, it opened up certain, things in my mind that I had around like what it means to say, oh, everything is alive, or to talk to a tree, or can I communicate with ancestors, or like idea of that, like to even not just be cynical and scoff at it and think of it as superstitious, and just entertain it, even like not necessarily say I agree, but entertain it, And I started having conversations with people, and it was a lot about intuition first, and then it started to get to be about spirit. And then honestly, in the last year, I had a lot of personal tragedy with one of my daughters, and I had a lot of ordeal, and I was kind of on my knees in one of those places in life, and kind of came to prayer in a new way that I'd never come to. And ultimately, I've been talking about it with folks who've been coming on the show here and there and having some really interesting conversations. And more recently, it had to do some with like a higher power, and whether or not, there's like a supreme being, or whether or not it's just like an impersonal universal force. So I mention this only because in leading up to those kind of like harder questions to talk about, some of the conversations just had to do with the idea of like, okay, everything's alive. So people can like go, most people, almost everybody I've spoken to can agree that you go into the forest, even as like not a thought, but like as a feeling, you can kind of get a sense, yes, the trees are alive. And I have a friend who got into mycology. I had her on the show recently, and we had a whole mycelium conversation, and the soil being alive. You've talked about that too. And everybody can seem to kind of get on board with the idea of everything kind of being alive when it's a tree and it's a soil. But there was a definite distinctive like breaking point when someone said, well, are you saying like rocks are alive? Or like stones are alive, like that's an inanimate object. And I didn't know how to like some part of me feels like, yes, I wear this stone around my neck and there's something to that for me, but I couldn't find a way to like speak to the idea that what normally is considered an inanimate object like a stone could be alive. And I think maybe you can. Can you make a case for us?
Well, I guess the first thing is to try to say that I'm not interested in like making a case in the sense of convincing anyone.
Right.
Convincing anyone of an animate universe, like it doesn't sound like a good use of time necessarily. But I think that there's so many things to explore around that, and I guess also I would say at the beginning, related to some of the things that you were saying, like there's kind of I think the dismissal, the modern day dismissal of what you could call like an animistic worldview has to do with kind of the sense that that's like woo woo, or if you're talking about like going out in the woods and seeing everything is alive, that's kind of fanciful or fantasy or some kind of
superstitious or something,
superstitious unmooring from reality. And ultimately, like really the realization of a living world brings us into a deeper relationship with our own responsibility and how we walk on the planet. And we can get into that a little bit later, but to feel the living presence in the universe and in nature all around us and in objects and in beings isn't just to feel it on some kind of fantastical ideal level. It's to feel all of a sudden, oh, how I walk in this place matters, what I do matters. Wade Davis has a very kind of famous thing on this where he says, like, what is going to be the difference in how you treat a mountain if you see that mountain as the source of all life, if you see that mountain as the source of the waters, if you see that mountain as providing context for all of the animals and vegetative life and animate beings that live in that place. If you are in a relationship with a mountain where you utterly and completely depend on it, then of course you see it as alive. Of course you see it as a living being. And then what's the difference between that and if you see the mountain as only of value in terms of its like board feet of timber, for example, right? And so we're facing kind of the consequences now of not seeing a living world. So there's an interesting thing in doing research for an episode that I'm doing now, which is coincidentally on the animacy of supposedly inanimate objects. There's an interesting thing I was reading in one of David Haberman's books about anthropomorphism, right? And how Western science and even Western theology kind of looks at our tendency to see like faces everywhere, to see life everywhere, to see beings everywhere, looks at it as, primitive, right? And Western scientists and Western theologians have made no bones about this. I mean, there are direct quotes you can find from colonial, settlers in India who basically said like, oh, the fact that Indians, worship rocks is absolute proof of, it's a lower civilization and this kind of colonial stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what I'm asking is, in a world in which we've completely dehumanized the planet, completely objectified the planet, in a world when kids can't even name the names of 5 plants that are growing in their backyard, in a world in which, we're on the verge of environmental collapse, specifically because we've seen the world as not alive, that I would see not anthropomorphizing the world as the far greater danger. Like, not to see a living world is far more dangerous for us. And, and like we talked about last time, ancestrally, all of our ancestors saw this world as alive. All of our ancestors interacted with a world that was alive. Why was this? Like, why is human history built on such a deep foundation of animacy? Well, it could be that perhaps they were seeing things a little bit closer to how they actually are. And this is where it's worth going into, so to get to, the the question of like rocks. this is where it's worth going into the fact that increasingly, when we do start to look deeper into what have long been considered, inanimate objects, we see life, we see sentience, we see animacy everywhere. And I'll give you some examples of this. So we'll start with trees, which I think, like you said, like everyone can, a lot of people can kind of agree that trees were sentient. Well, in the Western world, this wasn't so true just a short time ago. A short time ago, if you suggested that a tree was, sentient in any way, people would scoff at you. And now in the last 20 years, there's been so much work done that basically demonstrates the sentience of trees. There's an incredible book called by Suzanne Simard. I think it's called Searching for the Mother Tree or Finding the Mother Tree. And she did years of study on the responsiveness of plants and the ability of plants to communicate with one another and the ability of plants to respond to stimuli and to most probably feel what's going on, in their environment, and to make decisions about how they distribute nutrients and all this kind of stuff, right? And so we say, okay, well, maybe the picture is a little bit different than we thought. Well, then we have to look at like what science itself will say, right? If we want to have kind of a rigorous discussion around this. And we have to be clear about the fact that like modern Western science is, it's a little bit hazy when it comes to drawing definitive lines about what's alive and what's not. So it's not as simple as like there is a clear delineated line between what's alive and what's not. All the atoms that make you up are technically dead, right? Like all the atoms that make you up are technically dead. At what
like if you could separate the atoms
if you could separate the atoms out, like each one of them is dead
of its own. If they're not together as me or something, right? So what about the water that passes through you, right? 99% of our molecules are water molecules. We're 70% water by mass, but 99% of our actual water or our actual molecules are water molecules. Water seems to be an absolutely essential component of life on Earth, because every life form that we study, from mycelial life to mammals, to vegetative life, every life form that we study completely depends on water. So if we completely depend on water for our existence, and every life form does, is the water inanimate? Is it not alive? It's only inanimate if you separate it from its matrix, the matrix in which it lives. And traditionally, people haven't separated things like that. Modern Western science is kind of the first tradition to say, okay, we're going to separate this thing and study it completely separately. Science also, when it comes to consciousness, science has a very difficult time delineating what consciousness is, what is conscious and what isn't, right? So immediately, like, the picture gets a little bit more intricate. And within that, let's take the moon, for example. So the moon, from the Western scientific perspective, is a rock in space, right? Mm-hmm. A big rock up in the sky, right?
A big rock up in the sky. The moon, and scientists will tell you this straight up, is also responsible for all life on Earth. They say there would not be life on Earth, and you can look this up, there would not be life on Earth if it weren't for the moon, right? The moon is intimately linked to the movement of the waters on the Earth. The moon is intimately linked to the movement of the tides. It's quite possible that life developed in the tidal pools. It's quite possible that, like, the kind of ebb and flow of hormones within the human body, the ebb and flow of the circadian rhythms, all of these arose in union with the moon. The impact of the moon on all life on Earth is, it's being studied more and more, and an exhaustive study just came out showing the effect of the moon on ocean life, the effect of the moon on plant life, the effect of the moon on mammal life. everything is affected by the moon. So the moon is the center point, the hub of this great wheel of animacy, right? Do you then say, like, the moon is inanimate? Well, it's only inanimate if you separate it from its context. How do you separate it from its context? How do you separate us from our context? So your body is full of minerals, speaking of stone, right? Speaking of rocks, like, your body is completely full of minerals. Your body absolutely depends on those minerals to survive. Yesterday, we were stones. Stones are our ancestors. Yesterday, we were stones. Like, yesterday, who is it that says we are what the stones have the potentiality to become? I think it was either John Seed or Brian Swim. We are what,
right. We're stardust, right? We're made of stardust.
Yeah. And just a few short breaths ago in geological time, we were stones. Now, it gets even more interesting when you get into stones, and it's nice to be talking about stones. It's like, let's gets right to it, because that is the question you get if you have.
It's like a dividing line. Now, it was a dividing line in the conversation between things that we could see, feel as alive, and things we couldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then, you look at how central stones have been to human activity for so long. You look at, like, the black stone at the Kaaba in Mecca, which 2 million people go visit every year. You look at the Indian subcontinent, which is, a network of animate stones, and those stones are like the hubs of spiritual life, and they're charged with mantras and offerings, and I've seen 300,000 people go on a great pilgrimage to see a single stone, and I've stood in that line and I've seen that stone, and in seeing that stone, I felt something, right? Mm-hmm. And you can say, okay, well, this, like the moon, like the stones are these hubs, right? It's not something inherent about the stone. It's just that they're like a hub for all this adoration and worship and animacy. You can see it like that. And there's also something deeper about stones themselves, I mean, like, this entire conversation that we're having right now is made possible because of stone. Like, the internet, the silicon digital storage system in your computer, like, all of it is mineral. Like, the ability for silicon, the ability that silicon has to transmit energy, store energy, release energy.
Isn't it crystals? Aren't they basically crystals?
Yeah, it's mineral.
The internet runs on crystals. All the woo-woo people with their crystals.
Exactly. Yeah. And not only that, like, okay, the speakers that you're hearing me through, that's like copper wire, that's mineral, right? The copper wire vibrates. There's strontium and iron in the speakers. Like, they generate the sound waves travel through the air. How do they get picked up in your ear? They're these little bones that are coated in calcium, which is mineral, right? And they tremble, and then they send signals, nerve signals, which travel in your body along sodium crystals, right? Your entire nervous system is based on mineral conduction. Stones have the ability to conduct. Mineral has the ability to conduct, and this is deeply intertwined with what we call life, right? Animacy, movement, current passing through stone. All of this entire conversation is stones talking to stones, you could say, right? Yeah. So, like I said, I'm not going to try and, like, convince anyone stones think the way that humans do. Stones talk the way that humans do. But when you feel into it deeper and deeper, right, the issue that we get into is the attempted separation of us from the thing, right? The earth is a stone. Mm-hmm.
The observer and the observed, right?
Yeah, the observer and the observed. And ultimately, you can't really separate those two things. The earth is a stone, so absolutely all life on earth takes place within a great theater of stone. All of it. This life that we know came from stone, will return to stone, came from stone, will return to stone. Within this, to say something like the stones are grandfathers isn't abstract. It's real. It's very straightforward,
Well, I
And
would say, well, let me jump in for a second, only to say that like I think the minerals inside me, like the calcium in my ears, I think it's easier to see that or to feel that even as like, oh yeah, that's part of me. And because I'm an animate thing, it's part of that. And so it has an animacy to it. But like people worshiping the stones, that is easily written off as like religious hokum or whatever. And I think makes me think of the word like objective reality, because that's been a lot of the conversations when I try to talk about this with people who have like a more materialist bent.
Yeah.
That there's a idea of like what an objective reality is or something, and subject and object separation is like what you're talking about, maybe, right?
Yeah, and even the word object, if you dig deep enough, which is a horrible word, right? Like what's an object? Like a stone that's the center of like a whole community's adoration and song and story. Like, is that stone an object? Right, in terms of the power that it exerts on minds and the power that it exerts on hearts, is it an object? But even the word object, that kind of word that I try not to use too much, even that word object contains in its original etymology the understanding of that which is perceived by a subject. Right, there's a deep intertwining between subject and object that is not so easily extricated apart. In other words, the reason that stones look the way stones look, the reason that stones feel the way stones feel, the reason that stones have like texture and quality that are definable is because they're being perceived through five senses, because they're being perceived through an object, right? I mean, through a subject. Like if you take away the subject, the universe looks a whole lot different. In fact, it's kind of undefinable how exactly it looks. Am I saying there's no such thing as objective reality? No. But I'm saying that every sense that we have of like, oh, that rock is round, oh, that rock is smooth, all of that comes from assuming a subject who is about our height, has about our five senses, has our vision, right? It all assumes like an intertwined relationship. And, if you get deep into the sciences, you will find scientists who are very clearly talking about this. That
they all get mystical at some point if they're honest or something.
Yeah. And, like the extrication of the subject from the object in a world in which like we are what passes through us. We are the water that passes through us. We are the air that passes through us, in which beings are porous and completely intertwined with their surroundings. And I mean completely, right? Like the minerals that you're talking about that form part of your body, those aren't static. Those are being drawn in, through food, like through water, from the earth all around us all the time, right? Like there's this great wheel of existence. And within this wheel of existence, like, things, your body, like, again, grew from what we call inanimate, will become what we call inanimate again, right? And along the way, what you have is this incredible dance in which animacy and inanimacy are part of a continuum. They're not isolatable things, right? So, again, like, the heart of it, I've had experiences in India where I've been to temples where there are stones that have been meticulously cared for, and you could say like kind of charged with the vibration of sung mantras and given offerings and had things poured over them like again and again and again and again for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. And there's something there when you see it. There's something there. There's something that vibrates. There's something that hums. There's something that holds charge, because stones do hold charge. Like the stones that are most considered sacred in spiritual traditions are the stones that have the greatest capacity to hold electric charge. Quartz, which is revered in tradition after tradition after tradition, quartz is an acoustic and electric amplifier. It's used all the time for this purpose. Tourmaline and amber, which were very sacred to the ancient Greeks, they have definitive electric conductive qualities, right? So and life itself, what we define as life, is electric signals that are being passed along by mineral substances through biological matter, right? So, I had a science teacher once who said, why don't you do a term paper talking about how crystals are actually kind of a primitive form of life? Because crystals self-replicate and reproduce and this kind of thing. It gets even more interesting when you get to clay. The crystals in clay learn. The crystals in clay self-reproduce. The crystals in clay, not only do they self-reproduce, they change based on stimuli, right? That has led to a scientific hypothesis called the clay hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that life originated in clay, that life actually comes from clay. Clay in the ocean, but clay nonetheless, right?
Isn't that kind of a biblical thing too?
Yeah, well, that's what's interesting is that it's not just biblical. There are dozens upon dozens upon dozens upon dozens of world mythologies that say that the first human beings were made of clay. And I always kind of saw that as symbolic, like the shapeability of clay and this kind of thing.
Like a metaphor, yeah.
Like a metaphor, yeah. And now you can see that there actually is something deeper about clay itself, that it actually has, and you can look this up. Again, this isn't like far-fetched stuff, that clay actually, the crystalline structures within clay and the way that they learn and evolve and self-replicate. There was a big study done by Cornell University about this, that clay exhibits many of the characteristics of life. So, for me, it's like when we consider, first of all, that when it comes to Western science, the answers aren't so clear cut. It's not as clear cut as, this is alive and this isn't, this is conscious and this isn't, this is animate and this isn't. Those aren't lines that science has very clear, definitive answers for. So when you consider that, and you consider the place that stones, from the standing stones within the Celtic cultures to the goddess stones and Shiva stones within India to the black stone of the Kaaba to the way stones are treated in Aboriginal cultures, when you consider the place that stones have occupied, as hubs of animacy, and then you consider that we were once stone and we will be stone again, when you consider that it's like a continuum from the ancestral mineral lava volcanic form of the earth to what we are now to what we will eventually become, then you start to just open up, I think, the senses a little bit. To me, when I really feel into all of this that I call life is transpiring through a mineral matrix, right? It changes my viewpoint towards the stones. Now, okay, I mean, this is a cool conversation, right? But listeners might be like, why are we spending so much time talking about whether stones are conscious or not, right?
Well, we didn't even get to conscious yet necessarily.
Well, yeah.
But
stones are animate, stones are conscious, and again, those are words that have fuzzy boundaries. Those aren't words that are definitive even in the eyes of Western science, right? But what's a conversation like this for? It's to spark us into a different way of interacting and relating with things. A different way of interacting and relating with the world. So, it doesn't help too much for it to be a fully mental exercise, but I'm willing to bet that many people have had the experience. Maybe you went for a moonlight hike, out in the sandstone canyons. I'm willing to bet that many people have had the experience of being out among the stones and feeling the presence of the stones. Feeling even perhaps that something was watching, right? And for this upcoming episode, that you know the feeling I'm talking about?
I do. I mean, I would say that in the conversations I've had with people about this, I think you're right that everybody seems to kind of have had an experience like that, and will even agree in a feeling of wonder or awe or even sacredness around it. But it is often kind of linked to being more of a universal energy rather than a consciousness. And I know that's maybe a subtle line, but there is a little bit of a line there, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, but like lines, again, we think of personhood as like exhibiting the exact same features and characteristics that we exhibit. Mm-hmm. And, in traditional cultures, personhood, there's an expanded vision of personhood. And this expanded vision of personhood isn't going to say like, consciousness ends at your ability to think in words, or consciousness means that you think like humans think, or, when you really start to expand that vision of personhood, which again, really all of our ancestors had an expanded vision of personhood, then you don't have to so much get into like, hyper rational arguments about like, thinking exactly the way we think, or like speaking exactly the way we speak. One of the things that I talk about in a really old episode of the podcast called Stone Soup, which gets into some of these issues, is that like, if you really consider the story of a stone, what is the story of a stone? The story of a stone is that stone came from what?
If you trace it back, essential elements of the universe.
Sure. I mean, you're going far back right away. I just meant like from a mountain, right? A stone comes.
Okay. From a mountain. I went to. I was trying to go all the way from the source or something.
Well,
right?
We're going to, because where did that mountain come from? It comes from the planet. That planet comes from the galaxy. That galaxy comes from the source. Everything in this universe is a portal to the source. Right? When, worshiping a stone is using that stone as an access point to the source. Right? And whether or not you feel that there's something inherent about that stone, and that's up for each person to feel, but whether or not you feel that there's something inherent about that stone that like makes it alive, that stone is part of us and we are part of it. We are ultimately inextricable. It is our ancestor. And, that stone, the story of that stone is the story of the whole universe. So I say in that episode, like, the question isn't why would we worship a stone? The question is why wouldn't we worship a stone? Why don't we see this whole world as alive? Why don't we see it all as a portal to the vastness?
And do you think that, I think I know the answer, but seeing it as alive does lead to like worship? Because I think the reason why people don't worship stones is because it falls into like the idea of religion, and everybody's got all this baggage around that. I've been like really like reimagining the idea of religion for myself, son, like, so that I had someone on the show recently and he actually cited some yogic philosophy around, or he was looking at the etymology, that's right, of the word religion being like religio, and being like, he defined it as like when your soul is healed by connecting back to its source.
Yeah, to relink, to religate, right? Religion, to relink. Like, to relink is what everyone longs for. We long to, take this feeling of separateness that we have and to link and connect back. That's the purpose that ritual serves. And within that ritual purpose, right, and that's not, of course, then ritual structures can become kind of calcified, to use another mineral metaphor. They can become kind of calcified, and power structures can have, as they clearly do, all kinds of problems with them. But the fundamental human urge to relink, to reconnect, is inherent. It's inherent to what it means to be a being. Human beings feel separate in a way that most other creatures on the planet don't seem to. We feel separate from the world around us. And so ritual serves as a way for us to relink and to reconnect. The Western colonial view of like something like stone worship is, they must think that stone has some type of magic powers, and, it's idolatry in the Western mind. Right? Idolatry, like, it's detached from the understanding that the stone is a placeholder for the power that moves through everything. right? The stone is, like I said, like a portal to the source. Because when we take our loving attention to something and adore it, like George Washington Carver said, right? Like anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough, right? And to take our loving attention to something, whether that something is a person, a child, a dog, a forest, a mountain, a watershed, a planet, a stone, when we take our loving attention to something over and over and over and over and over again, then we find a portal to the eternal. We find a portal to the source itself. And that source itself, you know, and again, I'm not trying to convince anyone of this. Like, it brims with life. It teems with energy, right? In the Indian traditions, it is Shakti herself. It is the animate power of the cosmos expressed through everything, expressing everywhere through everything. Right?
Yes, yes, it is. Now, wait, let me jump in for a second, because I'm with you. And that I had a similar experience where I feel like it did open up my experience to what you're talking about. And I also have heard you say that I want to make note of. I heard you talk about how this idea of separating out, like the idea of objects, is also kind of relates to the idea of everything based in consciousness. That in fact, you can't be observing any of this without consciousness. The only way we know anything that we know is because of consciousness. And in a way, that's a case for everything being rooted in consciousness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, this is the beautiful meeting place of, you know, tantric tradition, like non-dual tantric tradition, in which the entirety of creation is an expression of the pulse of goddess consciousness or God consciousness, right? Or Shiva consciousness, Shakti consciousness, depending on the particular text or tradition you're talking about, right? And then within those tantric traditions, there are deep animist roots that see that within the pulse of universal consciousness, there are what you could call like vibrational and harmonic gradations and configurations that come to be known as beings, right? And that this universe is populated with beings. And you're not going to find a traditional culture that doesn't see a universe populated with beings. And when we see, and this is important because, you know, when you expand the vision to the full picture, the Western scientific view, which really came like in its full form around in like the last like 500 years or so, that every other person who's walked the planet until now has been quote unquote like wrong. like
we know better than all of them now, right?
Like in the 500 years, which is 0.1% and probably less of human history, 0.1% of human history, we've come to this great realization that none of this actually exists. Well, you know, animate traditions don't feel so uncomfortable with the subject and object being intertwined. In animate traditions, there's always going to be like what's going on inside the person is a reflection of forces that exist outside the person. And there are forces that exist inside and outside, right? Western science is going to say that's all brain chemistry, that's all subjective, right? That's all subjective. But the
emergent phenomena.
Yeah, but the subject is completely interwoven with and interpenetrated by the object. You really ultimately can't separate everything Western science knows. It knows through a subjective lens. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, when doing an experiment, it helps to be able to like isolate and look at things from a, you know, fairly neutral standpoint. Doesn't mean that. I'm not calling into question the entire history of separating out like the object, because sometimes that can be really important. But, you know, what it doesn't get at, right,
is the continuum of around the thing.
Yeah, is the continuum around the thing, the matrix in which it lives, the humming vibrational network in which it lives. The fact that like everything we know as universe, we know because of consciousness. We know because of subjective experience. try to describe the universe without consciousness. Like, what's a place? Try to describe a place to me. Like, a place is a point of perception. When you're describing a place, you're describing the way the place looked from a particular perspective through particular sense faculties, right? If you take that away, then it's a completely non-localized universe, right?
Some would say that there's nothing beyond that, though. That question I've had is, why do I take a step beyond? Why is there an other beyond this? Why isn't this just enough as it is? Why do we have to believe that there's something more? And my answer is because I felt it to be so.
Yeah, well, and and I get into this in the episode, and I mean, this is tricky, but like, if you're in this conversation with someone and they basically say, if you ask them like, okay, what does the universe look like without consciousness? They say, oh, well, it looks just like the universe except without consciousness, right? They haven't gone deep enough into the inquiry,
right,
because that still assumes an observer that's a particular size, a particular shape, a particular texture, a particular level of heart. Like, if you take away the observer, then what you're talking about, if you're talking about the universe from the perspective of, the fibers of reality that are a trillionth of the size of an electron, then the universe looks a whole lot different, right? If you're talking about the universe from the perspective of the universe itself, then the universe might just look like a heartbeat, right? If you're talking about the universe from the perspective of time, then what does the universe look like? If we say the universe is all these planets wheeling around, all we're saying is that the universe, or all of that, is in relation to the individual subject. So it helps to be able, right? And people take this, what I'm saying, to say, oh, he's saying that there's no such thing as objective reality outside of, the individual human consciousness or something like that. I'm not saying there's no such thing as objective reality. I'm saying that what we call object and what we call subject are intertwined on a level that can only be fully realized, really can only be fully realized in states of meditative union or felt rapture, right? We can't, we are inextricable from, imagine a stop motion film of, and film, I'm dating myself by saying film, but imagine like a stop motion, animation or something of this theater of stone, this planet, right? Giving rise to all of these vegetative forms and mammalian forms and, aquatic forms of life and all this kind of stuff, drawing from its mineral body to give birth to these forms. And then these forms returning to its mineral body and arising again. And all of it happening in relation to this, beautiful spherical stone in space. And what you start to see, is that the line between subject and object and the line between conscious and not conscious, consciousness completely depends on stone for its existence, right? The mineral, everything is anchored in stone if we want to take it back to rocks, right? And I'm talking about human consciousness. I'm not talking about ultimate consciousness when I say that. But what you see is that, the lines between animate, inanimate, the lines between not conscious and conscious, the lines between alive and dead, all of these things aren't exactly what we assume them to be. And that liminal space is worth exploring. Ultimately what it leads to, I think, is an understanding that the individual experience of the subject is profoundly important. And until science recognizes that and finds a way to include that, then it's going to be limited.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.